Good afternoon, or good morning, I guess, if you're on the West Coast. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking a lot about data and benchmarking and best practices as it relates to leveraging data to operate your business. And so we're excited to have you all here. Thanks for taking a little bit of time out of your day to join us. We're excited about today's session. We hope that you'll find it valuable and instructive and helpful as we approach the end of the year here and get ready to kick off 2024. So happy holidays to all of you, and thanks for spending a few minutes with us here before everybody checks out and spends time with family here later this month. So just a couple of housekeeping items to share as we get kicked off. Everybody's going to be on mute. You can come off of mute at the end for the Q&A portion of the webinar, although I can't remember the last time anybody actually came off of mute and asked a question. So usually the easiest way to do it is to just drop that question into the chat in the webinar app chat function. Drop the question in there. We'll get those questions, and at the end, we can cover any questions that come in from the attendees today. Also, we will be recording today's webinar, and we'll share out a recording and the slide deck with all those who registered within the next few days. So keep an eye out for that. This is also a CPE eligible webinar. So keep in mind that in order to get CPE credit for attending the webinar, you will have to answer the poll questions that are asked during the webinar. There'll be 4 of them spaced throughout the webinar. So pay attention to those as they get put up on the screen, and answer those so that you can get that CPE credit. And then we'll send out the CPE certificates over the next several days as well. Also, there will be a quick survey at the end that I'll remind everybody about as we wrap up the webinar today. And we would love to get your feedback at the conclusion of the webinar. So just by way of background, I'm confident that most of you on here are familiar with Richie May and know a bit about our experience in and involvement in the mortgage industry. But for any that might be on here that aren't familiar with it, the firm has been around for almost 40 years. And for most of that time has been specializing in serving the mortgage industry. And we serve the industry across audit, tax, compliance services, internal audit, cybersecurity, of course, data and benchmarking, which we'll be talking about today. We provide outsourced accounting services. So we serve a variety of client needs within the mortgage industry, and always look for opportunities to add value to our clients, to bring the expertise that we have and the talented individuals we have on the team to add value to and support our clients in their various needs. So as we kick today off, one of those services that we have offered for a long time is data and benchmarking. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Molly Manuzak, who leads our data analytics practice here at the firm. And Molly has a number of years of experience in the mortgage industry, including several here at Richie May. And so she has an extensive background around data that she'll be drawing on today, and including the background of having served many of our clients around data and benchmarking. And she'll be sharing best practices, things that come up regularly as she's working with clients. So I'm pleased to be joined by Molly today. And I'm Nathan Lee. I'm one of the partners here at the firm. I lead both the mortgage banking niche across audit, tax, and advisory, and also have dual responsibility for leading the advisory practice at the firm. I've been here for many years, been involved in the industry for a long time, and it's been a wonderful place to build a career and work over the years. So we we consider you all friends in addition to clients, and we thank you for your business and relationships that we've been able to forge over the years. So as we dive in, I just wanted to frame this up a little bit for everybody. You can see the agenda on the screen, and I'll just share some high-level comments here as we kick things off. But we here at Ritchie May have been involved in data and benchmarking clients' performance for a long time, going back probably 25 plus years at the firm. And our capabilities and the services that we provide around data have evolved over that time. But we've been involved in doing this for many years and get a lot of questions from clients around benchmarking and how to access data that helps them operate the business. And it now, perhaps more than ever, or probably I wouldn't even say perhaps, I would say now more than ever, data is critical for the owners and operators, leaders of mortgage companies. The industry is changing, obviously, rapidly. It has changed a lot, and it's changing as we speak. It's a far more competitive landscape right now. We came off of a couple wildly profitable years with tremendous volume, and I would say actually we had consistently high volume for many years prior to that as well, maybe with the exception of a couple of years there in the financial crisis. But we've actually had steady, consistently high volume for most of the last 20 plus years, except for last year and this year, of course. And that's likely to continue, at least to a certain extent, for a while. There are just a number of factors leading to a lower origination volume, not only currently, but probably over the next several years as well. We hope, obviously, that it gets better in the spring. Rates are drifting downward now, and hopefully there'll be Fed rate cuts not in the too distant future that will help here this next year. I would expect 24 to look a little bit better than 23, which I'm sure everybody is crossing their fingers and also hoping for. But the industry has changed, and the competition for production, whether the producers themselves or the loans, just margins are tight. Companies have to pay attention to efficiency. Compensation has been a challenge because of the tight labor market over the last several years. And the owners and operators of mortgage companies are just looking to leverage any competitive advantage they can as they fight through this much more competitive market. And so as you look at the significance of data, one of the challenges that has always existed is the disparate locations of all of that data. You hear terms like, data warehouse and connecting up through API to your different systems where you have a lot of operational and production and borrower data. But a lot of companies struggle with bringing that all together so that they can munge that data together and build reports that are drawing on data from multiple sources, and doing that in a way that allows them to see real-time changes. And then on top of that, a lot of companies have access to benchmarking data of one kind or another from one or more sources, and pulling that together so that it can be leveraged in one place is also critical. And doing so with live data or more live real-time data has always been a challenge that the industry has faced. Get benchmarking reports that are a few months old, and a lot of things have changed over that couple or few months. And so what we're going to talk about here today are best practices around accessing data, getting it in one place where it can be easily digested, manipulated, and where reports can be produced that are exactly what the leaders and operators of a company need to actually make decisions and drive the business forward. So again, I'm excited to be joined by Molly and look forward to what she's going to share here on this webinar. Thank her for the time that she spent preparing for it, and hope that you all find it valuable here today as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Molly, and she'll go ahead and dive in.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nathan, for the introduction. And again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. I understand it's a very, very busy season as everybody's hoping to, dive into the holidays here in a couple weeks. So as Nathan mentioned, my team is responsible for multiple analytic and benchmarking offerings. Some of those we've been offering, like our financial benchmarking for, well over a decade, close to 15 years. And then we have our business intelligence platform, and we have benchmarking integrated within that platform on key metrics as well. So I'm going to be pulling from that experience to really guide you through those best practices in driving your company towards more data-led decision making. So high level, we're going to talk through some challenges first that we see day to day and that we're working with clients to mitigate. And then I'll dive into really how to implement that data effectively and make it an integral part of decision making across the entire organization, not just in those silos that we often see. So really there are some common challenges that we see that clients face, that we're working with people to mitigate. So one of those big challenges that Nathan mentioned was that data is often siloed across an organization. The data sits in different places. People are paying attention to the data that impacts just them or just their business unit. And a lot of times what this can lead to is potentially duplication of data and reporting, and really contribute to an overall overload of data within the organization. So typically we hear from a lot of people about like analysis paralysis. Really, there's just too much data. And a lot of times when there's too much data, it's not well maintained. So there are likely competing or even conflicting reports, which can also lead to a lack of trust in the data. So oftentimes, if there's too much data or outdated reports or reports with gaps in it, people will really just shy away from it and start to maintain their own reports that they can control, which again contributes to kind of that data silo problem. Another trap that we commonly see is just focusing on internal data, which ultimately can lead to a gap in the larger picture. You might be missing out on key insights or areas that need improvement. And a lot of those insights can be gained from incorporating benchmarking and other external sources of data. So before I dive in, we'll have our first poll question, but we're going to start looking at what data should you be paying attention to. So I'm going to pause here. So we have our first poll question. Again, please get those answers in if you are looking for that CPE credit. So the question is, do you have access to all of the data that you need in one place to run your business as efficiently as possible? Yes, no, or I don't know. So we'll give everybody a few seconds to get those answers in.
And as a reminder, you need to answer all 4 poll questions to be CPE eligible. We have about 30 seconds still left and a bunch of people still yet to vote. So I want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to get the CPE if you would like it. Thank you. Okay, Molly, it looks like almost everyone is in. I'm going to go ahead and close and share the results.
Okay. Thank you, Felicia. Okay, so it looks like the vast majority said no, and that's certainly in line with feedback that we've received, time and time again in talking with clients and, others within the industry. So when we're thinking about different sources of data, again, we really want to be focused on that larger picture, see sources from across the entire organization, again, to start breaking down those data silos that we see. But we don't want to limit it to just organizational data. We really want to look at that external data or benchmarking as well, which we'll dive into a bit later. So when you're thinking about data, you want to think about viewing multiple sources of data and looking at them together. So combining those sources of data to get even more meaningful insights into what's going on in your organization to really help answer your questions and help you take action. However, we certainly see sometimes that too much data is a problem. So we don't necessarily want to connect every single source of data just because it's available. That will lead to that information overload, and we want to use our time and resources efficiently. And we really want to be discerning in the data that we're selecting to pull into the reporting system. So a few questions that you kind of want to keep in mind before connecting to a data source. Overall, what are you trying to get out of this data? What questions are you trying to answer? And then we want to be thinking about, is this the right data source to answer those questions? And do I really need to bring it in, or is there any sort of duplication going on? So for example, do we need to connect to a brand new data source when all of that same data is already available, say, in the LOS that we're already reporting on? In that case, the answer would be no. You don't necessarily need to bring it in if it's not adding value. So thinking about where to start, so typically we see the most success and we connect to the LOS first. Since this is typically, kind of a main source of data, we can get a lot of good information and important KPIs, about production and operational metrics. But then we want to start thinking about layering in additional sources of data to really open you up to more meaningful insights. So the second data source we recommend connecting to, and what we typically do, is bring in the GL data to really allow us to start to dive into those financial metrics. Again, you can get some really great metrics there, but if you do join those two data sources, that really is going to open you up to seeing a larger picture and really slice and dice the data in new ways. You could see metrics like cost per loan, branch profitability, profitability at the loan officer level, etc. And then from there really are a number of different data sources that we work with. But really what's important here is to bring in the data that can answer more of your questions, that can really drive change. So after the LOS and the GL, some systems that we commonly work with are, HR or payroll data, CRM data, so you can really look at conversion rates, and then servicing data. And then after that, we're typically getting into more industry agnostic data, again, to give you a larger picture of the entire organization. And then we do, of course, want to consider that external or that benchmarking data as well. And ideally, we do want to be able to see everything together. So you're not always toggling between multiple systems. You have everything available to you right in the reporting platform. Really, this is going to help you see that entire organization, see that larger picture, and start answering those questions that you had to begin with. So as a quick example, if I'm reviewing my underwriting department, looking at metrics, I'm likely going to start with the LOS. Certainly a great place to start. You can see a lot of great metrics like capacity, files worked, business days to get a file approved. And then I might want to also look at my GL to see payroll expenses, maybe some HR data to see headcount. But ultimately what I want to do, instead of just looking at these data sources separately, is combine the data sources to really get some more meaningful metrics. So when I start combining my data sources, I'm getting a larger picture. I can see things like cost per file, which I can't always see with just one data source, and then loans per underwriter. So really utilizing the tools within the platform, you want to be bringing in multiple data sources to get to those, more in-depth metrics. A lot of times though, when you're looking at reporting to answer your questions, it's going to bring up more questions, which is fine. You want your reporting to be answering questions over time. You don't want to just build out a report to answer one question and never use it again. So maybe I noticed, for example, costs have trended up over recent months, but just looking at my internal data, I can't really figure out why. There hasn't been too much of a shift in headcount. Our production hasn't shifted too much. So really, I want to start looking at that external data to maybe compare myself to different peer groups. How do my costs compare? So we'll go ahead and circle back to this example later to see how layering on additional external data sources can bring more actionable insights and answer those questions. So we've talked through the data sources that we need to drive that decision making. Now we're going to talk through how do we bring that data into the system, and what are best practices for connecting and maintaining it, again, to drive those decisions. So first, we want to think about how are we going to bring data into the platform? These days, data sits in so many different places across an organization, system to system. How can we access it and use it for reporting? So there's a few things that we want to consider. Typically we're looking to see first if there's an API connection we can use. This is often a really great connection method because you're able to update the data frequently and get that data in near real time. That's of course going to depend on the availability and limitations within the API, but there's really a lot of benefits to using APIs, and most systems these days do have an API that you can access. Another way to bring in data is using any sort of existing database tables or data warehouses. Again, these can typically be refreshed frequently and real time or near real time. Of course, that's going to depend on the cadence in which that underlying data is updated, but that's often a good way to leverage what you have built out already in order to bring data into the reporting platform. And then of course, there's always going to be things like flat files or things that have to be manually updated. But what we want to keep in mind with those is, since they have to be manually updated, it does take somebody going in and updating or pushing that update through. So we really want to avoid manual updates as much as possible. So we want to have our data updating automatically and frequently as much as possible. And when you do have things that need to be manually updated, you just want to ensure that processes are in place so that those continue to get updated and that data doesn't become stagnant. So really what you want to be looking for is a way to connect to various data sources, which again is likely mortgage specific solutions and then industry agnostic data sources as well. And you need a way to accommodate the fact that data just lives in so many places. Another thing to consider with data connection strategy is that we really want to have a single source of truth with data. We don't want people building off reports off of similar tables. That can really lead to data inconsistencies and again, that lack of trust in the data and in the reporting. And then as far as cadence of data, kind of similar to those connection strategies, we want to consider the frequency of data and then how it's being updated. So depending on the source, we want the frequency to be, essentially real time or as close to it as possible. Some data sources like the LOS, that's going to be really key for. You can use, the LOS for pipeline tracking, for looking at operational and production trends. That's an instance where the higher frequency is definitely useful, and you want to have a system that can keep up with that. But that's not always necessary for every source of data. So the GL, for example, that higher frequency isn't as important, and so it's not going to be an effective use of getting that data in to update that every 15 minutes. You can update that once a day. Really, those less frequent updates are typically sufficient. And then as far as how often the data is updating, you just want to make sure that that's automatic, so you don't have to go in and push a button to get that updated. Again, we really want to minimize those manual interventions and updates whenever possible. Again, that's not always avoidable, but whenever possible. So we want that data to be automatically update on a schedule. Again, that'll depend on the data source. And then you also want to ensure that all of your downstream, calculations, joins, and especially the reporting, that's all linked together so that when the data is updated from your source, so when that raw data is coming in, that's impacting the reporting right away. You don't want to have your LOS data updating every 15 or 30 minutes and then have that reporting update once a day. That's just not going to be as effective. And then with the structure of the data, there's a few things to consider, but most of these kind of go back to those common pitfalls we talked about earlier. So within a data source, you want to keep in mind, you just want to pull in what's needed for the reporting that you're building out. So we don't have to bring every data attribute in. A great example is the LOS. Typically, when we're connecting to that, we're starting with 50 or 60 different attributes of data, but ultimately an LOS can have hundreds or even thousands of data attributes. So we do want the ability to add as needed, but you just want to bring in the data that you need to answer your questions. Again, we don't want to be overwhelming your users who are ingesting the data or those working with the data. You also want to consider how is a data source going to work with other data sources. So how are you going to join that data together, again, to get those more meaningful insights? Typically, we're looking for a truly unique identifier, like loan number, that can be used to join to CRM or to the GL. But here, especially, you really want to avoid using a manually updated identifier. So if somebody's typing in their name, there can of course be human errors with that. So we just want to make sure we're joining on that unique or consistent identifier, so we're not causing any sort of data integrity issues. Another thing to consider is kind of consistency and standardization across data sources. So calculations should be consistent, field names should be consistent where applicable, and then even table structures where applicable. And then lastly, we do want to maintain some documentation about the sources of data that we're bringing in. For example, what attributes are we bringing in, what kinds of data, and then it might be relevant to also keep documentation either for your users or for those developing reports on the calculations and logic being used so that they're consistent across reports. That can be really important if there has been a history of duplication or competing reports. You really want to collaborate with the business users to ensure that there's consistent logic across the organization to ensure everybody is on the same page. Kind of lastly, with connecting data, you really want to consider the security of your data. So those overall data permissions. Layers of data permissions should include a few things. So typically you want to think through, what can a user access within the system? So not everybody should be able to update reports. Typically we recommend that most, users of a reporting system are just ingesting reports, and then there's, a few people managing the system with the ability to make updates and changes. And then you want to have the ability to manage what is shared with users. Not everybody needs access to all of the reports. Again, we want to consider that information overload. We see a lot of success in sharing reporting out by role or by department. And that way all of your branch managers or all of your loan officers are seeing the same thing. But what they're seeing should be customized to them based on data permissions at the data level. So really that is looking at how much data should a user see. So an executive is likely going to see the full picture. They're going to see, for example, all of the loans in the LOS, whereas a branch manager should just see loans within their branch, and likely a loan officer should just see loans assigned to them. And then as far as, maintaining kind of the data connections going forward, connecting new data sources, you really want to have, somebody who's responsible for the permissions and then for maintaining and updating those data connections. This is another place that documentation is important, or at least ensuring more than one user knows how to, make these changes and keep the data updated. And then of course, with that security, we want to make sure that we're sharing appropriate data with users. We don't want to be sharing out data that a user shouldn't have access to. And ultimately, we do want reporting to be an integral part of the organization. So you want your users to be relying on the data. So it's really important that if data connections break or are interrupted, that those are fixed quickly so that people aren't slowed down. And again, with things that aren't updating, if connections break, that can lead to that mistrust in data. So we have our second poll question here. So the question is, are the insights you're currently measuring actionable?
Wow, everybody came in really quickly.
Great.
So thank you all. We're going to keep it open for just about 10 more seconds just to get that last group in there. Okay, thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and share these results.
Okay, great. So it looks like a lot of you are already getting actionable insights out of your data. That's great. That's really what we want. We want to be using data to drive business decisions, to make changes. So we'll talk through, how we can use pulling in multiple data sources and the connection strategies, and take that next step in order to drive those changes. So we don't necessarily want to build out every report imaginable once we have the data in our system. We do really want to keep in mind a few best practices in terms of reporting. So first, we really want to think through, what questions are we trying to answer? What are you trying to solve with a report before you build it out? We don't want to be building out reports just to have something to look at. It should be giving us actionable insights. It should be meaningful. It should help us make decisions about the business. So an example of that is, I might want to look at funded production. And so when I'm looking at production numbers, of course, I want to see units in volume, but I really want to go above and beyond that. So I should be looking for things like trends over time. So how am I comparing period over period, both long-term and short-term? So year-to-date versus last year, even month-to-date versus last month. Another thing to think about is, maybe we're tracking certain goals. Maybe we have production goals by loan officer or by branch. Are we on track or behind on these goals? So if you're going in with those questions, that's really going to dictate the reporting that's built out. And that should be driving our reporting. So really, what insights do we need to add? Another thing that we want to consider is the audience of the report. So most likely the ultimate audience is not going to be the analyst or the developer who's building out the reports. It's likely going to be, the business user. So it might be somebody like the executives. And really, when we're building out reports for somebody at that level, we really want to keep things, simple and distilled enough that they can really understand what they're looking at, and that they'll want to continue to go back to the reports to answer their business questions. But of course, you're not always building out reports for executives. You might be building out reports that are going to be shared across the organization, or maybe for branch managers or loan officers. So you just really want to be considering the audience as you're building out the reporting. One of the pitfalls that that I've brought up a few times is that overload of data. We do get a lot of feedback related to that analysis paralysis, where there's too much data, too many metrics, they aren't meaningful to anybody. And then people really do lose interest and they stop paying attention. So that's why it's really critical that your business users are involved in the reporting process. Reports should not just be up to the analyst or the developers. So this is where it's really important to use somebody with, experience, use somebody, who's a mortgage industry expert. That can really be useful, because you want to use somebody who understands the industry, what's needed to run a mortgage company. You don't want to have to be explaining all of these industry terms to somebody. So it's really important to kind of leverage business users and people with experience. And then again, as far as reporting goes, we really want to minimize the overall number of reports. We don't want to report on everything just because we have the data for it. Again, we want to reduce that overwhelm for the users. And that will also make it easier to maintain your reports and, make updates over time. So using some of these best practices that we've been talking about, we can accomplish this through reporting and, some of the tools that we use, some of these tools we're using with our clients daily. A few that come to mind that are really, really impactful are ensuring that we have a single source of truth, again, to mitigate any sort of duplication of reporting, and ensuring the users who are building out reports are using that same data source. And then setting up permissions based on the user, again, to give that custom view to users, so you don't have to build out reports for each individual branch. You can share the same report with all of your branch managers. And then another thing is using things like filters and being able to adjust timeframes, as opposed to having an individual report for each product or for each time frame or for each really data segment. We don't want to have separate reports for everything. We want to be combining, similar reports, again, so that we don't have a huge number of reports that's going to overwhelm users. And lastly, we want to think about, how are we getting these reports out to users? So not everybody's going to log into a reporting system every single day. Everybody has a lot of their plates. So we still want to be able to share insights with our end users effectively and drive them into the reporting platform when necessary. So a couple of ways to do that is sending reports out on a scheduled basis, or using a trigger within the data, maybe a production goal, to send somebody an alert hey, your production goal for December or for 2023 was just met, or you're behind by X%, letting them know, throughout the month or week by week. Ultimately, we want the entire organization to rely on these reports. We don't want users to just stop ingesting the data because they're overwhelmed, or again, there's too many reports that aren't answering their questions. So we really want to be considering, how can these reports be driving change? What insights can be gained that's going to lead to better decision making? So now we have our third poll question. So that'll pop up here shortly. Okay, so the question is, do you have access to real-time industry benchmarking? Yes, yes, but it's static and not timely, no, or unsure.
And again, thank you all for getting these answers in quickly. We're almost to that same percentage. Keep it open for about 10 more seconds to get those last votes in there. Okay, Molly, it looks like we're pretty close. I'm going to go ahead and close it and share the results.
Sounds good. Okay, so it looks like the majority either said their benchmarking was static, not updated in a timely manner, or they didn't have access to real-time industry benchmarking. That certainly makes sense. That's definitely the feedback Nathan mentioned. That's what we've been hearing for years. So really, so far, we've discussed the importance of connecting to multiple data sources. Really, we've been focused on that more internal data, but integrating that external data, that industry benchmarking will give you a larger, more holistic view of not only your company, your organization, but the industry as a whole. So benchmarking is really key. Why should you benchmark? Benchmarking can be used to see how you're stacking up in comparison to the competition. Again, you can see, how do we compare to the industry at large? And really what we want to be using is real-time industry benchmarking. So when you're looking at different products and offerings out there, there's a few things to keep in mind that you really want to be looking for. So the first one is, how often is that data refreshed? How long do I have to wait to get those insights? So again, we want the results to be as real time as possible, depending on the source of data that's being benchmarked. So for example, through our production and operations benchmarking, we're able to get that data updated in real time every single day to really let you make those, answer your questions in real time to drive that decision making. But again, it depends on the data source. That doesn't always make sense. But really what you want to ensure is that your benchmarking is available in a timely manner. Financial benchmarking, for example, that makes sense to see that on a less frequent basis, just with the nature of that data source. It's not being, books are not being closed out every single day. But really you just want that benchmarking, again, real time or as close to that as possible to allow you to drive your business with, those real time decisions as things are constantly changing. And so another thing to consider is what peer groups are available. So you want to be looking at peer groups, make sure that you have access to all of the peer groups so you can see like and not like peer groups. You want peer groups to be broken out in a meaningful way so you know what you're comparing yourself to. And then you do want to be able to see that entire participant base, really give you that high level view of trends, regardless of company size and structure. So within peer groups and then within the benchmarking, we really want to make sure that we're getting meaningful comparisons or really getting those apples to apples comparisons. So when you're looking at peer groups, again, that's important, but also when you're looking at the metrics in the benchmarking. So, an example here is, are the turn times or production numbers meaningful to my organization? So within, our operational benchmarking, we're using different loan stages, and we're working to ensure that they're consistent across an organization. Oftentimes we'll see companies using, milestones that are named very similarly, but they're not always using them in the same manner. So you want to make sure that you understand what you're looking at and you're confident that you're truly getting meaningful insights and not comparing yourself to, a participant base or a peer group that's using the milestones in a significantly different way from you. And then if you're looking at something like financial benchmarking, something to consider is, are you able to see, again, those apples to apples comparisons? Oftentimes there's a variation in business models, across the industry. So we really want to make sure that we understand what's included or excluded in a report, and then any assumptions that might be made, regardless of the product that you're looking at. So on my screen, here's an example of our net production income report. This is really meant to show profitability on production. We're removing a number of different things to make it meaningful so everybody can have a more apples to apples comparison. Just one quick example is we're removing anything related to servicing because that's not applicable to everybody. And we're putting that in a completely separate report. So again, just understanding what you're comparing yourself to and ensuring you understand inclusions and those assumptions within the metrics. We also want to be able to dig into the data to see it more granularly and see subsets of the data. So a lot of times with benchmarking, you're just going to be seeing totals, but we really want to be able to filter and slice and dice the data to get those more meaningful insights and help you answer some additional questions. So can you compare conventional versus government? Can you adjust the time frame that you're looking at? So really getting into detailed subsets of the data. Another great use of benchmarking is not only looking at kind of a static point in time, but seeing variances or trends over time. Of course, it's helpful to see how you're relating to peers as far as current production, but trends can sometimes be even more meaningful. For example, my funded production might be high or low compared to similar sized companies. That certainly tells me part of the story, but variances can really enhance that and help me determine how the peers are trending as well. So are my peers also trending in that same direction as I am? Is my production maybe lower than the peer groups over the period? Really to just help give me additional insight as I'm looking through, the benchmarking metrics. So like we've talked about, internal analytics, single sources of data, even a single benchmarking product individually, these can all give you really good information, but we really want to focus on that larger picture of the entire organization and the industry at large. So using a combination of those data sources is really going to help you see that full picture. So we'll circle back to the example that we started with earlier, looking at internal data, looking at underwriting metrics. That led to some questions about our underwriting costs. When we looked at internal data from GL, from payroll expenses, it looks like those expenses have trended higher, but I couldn't really figure out why. And I'm curious about how we're stacking up compared to peers and the overall industry. So we can really start to use some of the other, benchmarking tools that we've discussed to drill in and get some answers there. So first, I can start looking at financial benchmarking to see how efficient my underwriters are compared to peers. When I look at loans closed per underwriter, it actually tells me we're closing fewer loans compared to the peer groups I'm looking at. However, when I look at overall production numbers, we're pretty well in line with the peer groups. So, this doesn't really help explain why my costs have trended higher recently, but we also are less efficient compared to peers that I'm looking at. So then I might look at total headcount, and I notice that total headcount is actually in line or above the different peer groups I'm looking at. So I might also want to look into costs, and it looks like my overall expenses for the underwriting department are also high compared to the peer groups that I'm looking at. So since my headcount is higher, that could certainly contribute to the higher costs that I'm seeing. But that doesn't necessarily contribute to the loans closed per underwriter. So really, I haven't answered that secondary question I came up with, but I have gained some additional insight from benchmarking and helped, drive me towards an answer on my original question. However, the financial benchmarking I'm looking at isn't updated as often as my internal data. So I'm going to go ahead and update that real-time benchmarking to try to get, some additional insights there. So I can go back, into my reporting system. I can really see the operational benchmarking. Again, that's updated every single day. This might help me figure out if there's a timing problem. Are my turn times higher? Is that leading to my underwriters being less efficient? And when I look at the data, it does look like turn times are a little bit higher. That's kind of fluctuating month over month. So it doesn't necessarily seem like a recent problem, seems more of a historical problem. So then I can really use some of those tools that we discussed. I can start filtering the data, slicing and dicing by loan type, really dive in to see if there's a more granular subset of my data that's really going to help, help me answer the questions that I have about the efficiency of my underwriting department. And then from there, I can layer on analytics on my internal data to really see, if certain individuals, are contributing to those increased turn times, just really dive in there. So here I can look at specific loan types, again, individuals, continue to slice and dice the data and even drill in to see what's going on there. And ultimately, this might, help me pinpoint some training opportunities. Maybe we have one or two newer individuals on staff, or maybe, we released a few new loan products recently, and it looks like some of the underwriters haven't completed their training on it, or they just need some more training on it, because that's kind of increasing the averages overall. So really, I'm able to utilize benchmarking, and especially that real-time benchmarking, to help guide us towards the answers to those business questions that we have and ultimately drive those business decisions. So again, we want to see that combination of data to get that more holistic view. And ultimately, this will help us determine where we should be expending our time and efforts, which is, always important, but has been increasingly important over the last couple years and likely going into the new year as well. So really, we want to focus on getting real-time data, both internal and external, because in this market, you really have to be able to pivot and make adjustments in real time in order to compete and run as efficiently as possible. So using a lot of the best practices that we've discussed today, that can really help push you towards taking action instead of just ingesting numbers and looking at reports just to look at them. So certainly feel free to reach out if you want to have a conversation, want to dive in a little bit more. But really, more than ever, it really is important to have that trusted industry advisor with you on your data journey. So thank you guys so much for your time. We do have one last poll question, and then we'll go ahead and dive into Q&A.
So Molly, the question is, what is your outlook for next year? More production, less production, or we'll see what Santa brings? We have almost everybody in. Again, I'll keep it open for about 10 more seconds. Want to make sure those who want CPE credit have a chance to answer this question. To get that credit, looks like just a couple more people. And let's see. Okay, looks like I got everybody in. I'm going to close the poll now and go ahead and share the results. Looks like folks are also looking to see what Santa's going to bring.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we're hearing is that folks are trying to be cautiously optimistic leading into 2024, especially after the last couple of years. So it does look like we have a few minutes for Q&A. As Nathan mentioned, feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll go ahead and dive in.
I do have one here,
Okay.
Molly, and it's around. It looks like selecting peer groups. Says what are best practices for selecting a good peer group to benchmark against?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So definitely something important to consider, when looking at benchmarking products. You want to make sure the peer group that you're comparing yourself to is statistically meaningful. So you want to be looking at, you don't want to compare yourself to a peer group of just a couple of companies. You want to compare yourself to a bit larger of a peer group. You also want to consider kind of the makeup of that peer group. So size, channel mix. This will allow you to compare yourself to not only like peers, but also to peers that aren't set up quite so similar to yourself. So benchmarking really is helpful whether you're comparing yourself to a peer group that's like you or not. You don't want to just limit yourself to looking at similar peer groups. Again, you might be missing out on some of those really important insights. You might also be missing out on opportunities for improving your business by, going into, maybe a new channel or a new product, or seeing what things might look like, if your production really increases. So ultimately, you want to be comparing yourself to various peer groups and not limiting yourself to just peer groups that are like how you're structured.
Yeah. Now I'll just add a quick comment as a follow-up to that. And you touched on this, Molly, and that is, as you look at benchmarking yourself, channel is really important. Channel and operating model. And so you'll have pretty significant differences between a company operating a wholesale channel versus one that's retail, for example. I mean, it's obvious, but it's important when selecting a peer group. There are sources of benchmarking data that are just a conglomeration of a whole bunch of data from a whole bunch of companies, and it isn't really normalized where you're matching up apples to apples so that everybody's reporting the same things in the same way. And it also doesn't break out as effectively different channels. And so I would say it's really important to watch that carefully. And as you select a peer group, one of the things that we do is apply some real thought to who we select as peer companies to use in the benchmarking work that we do for our clients, to make sure that you really have a group of apples to apples comparisons geographically, channel, and so on. So yeah, just some extra thoughts here.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, there's another question just as it relates to this, probably because it's a hot topic these days. As it relates to AI, the Chat GPT, is there any application for that within business intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a hot topic and something that we're discussing that's coming up with our clients all the time. Things like, of course, ChatGPT, but there's so many other generative AI models to consider. Machine learning, predictive analytics. It's definitely something that you should consider when thinking about data analytics. Is that something that the reporting system you're using can handle? Do they have integrations? Is that on the roadmap? It's certainly something that we're discussing internally and actively exploring. But yeah, it's certainly a hot topic, and it's going to have some pretty big impacts, I think.
Yeah, no question. Well, we are out of time. We'll make sure that we follow up with any other questions individually here after the webinar. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it was recorded, and we'll send out the recording and slide deck here over the next few days. And please take a minute to answer or fill out the survey that will pop up here as we wrap up the webinar. And just want to thank all of you again for participating, and thank Molly for the work that she put into sharing a lot of these thoughts and best practices with everybody. As I mentioned, we've done data and benchmarking work here at the firm for many years. And this is something that we're helping a lot of our clients with, and we get a lot of questions about. If you have questions and you want to talk about some best practices around data and how to leverage a platform that brings data together in one place and benchmark in real time, some of those things that we feel are really valuable when operating a business in the current environment. If you want to talk about those and have questions, reach out to us, and we can provide some guidance and support to you as you try to accomplish that important goal in 2024. So it's a good resolution for the new year, and we're here to help you and support you in accomplishing it. So thank you again, and happy holidays to everybody. Happy New Year, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again soon.